Dr. Danielle Carter, a highly respected black physician, boarded her flight with one hope: to finally rest after days of relentless work. Instead, she was met with prejudice when a fellow passenger demanded she be moved to economy class. Tensions quickly escalated, but when that same passenger's son fell gravely ill mid-flight, the only person able to save his life was the very person he had wronged, Danielle. Would she rise above the discrimination and help, or would she let injustice take its toll? Watch this powerful story unfold to see how a moment of prejudice transforms into a life-changing experience for all involved. What would you have done in Danielle's place? Subscribe for more inspiring stories and share your thoughts in the comments below. The Seattle sky was painted in shades of deep violet and orange as Dr. Danielle Carter stepped out of the conference center. The city's skyscrapers shimmered in the fading light, casting long shadows as night settled in. A crisp chill in the air offered a welcome respite from the stuffy, formal environment where she had spent the past 3 days, surrounded by colleagues at the Global Emergency Medicine Summit. The summit was over, and Danielle longed for a break from the tireless networking and constant need to be on her toes. She walked slowly, dragging her suitcase behind her, while her worn carry-on dangled from her shoulder. The conference badge identifying her as Dr. Danielle Carter, emergency physician, still hung around her neck, but for the first time in days, she was glad to leave that part of her behind, if only for a moment. All she craved now was a moment of peace. It had been a hectic week. Danielle had given a keynote address on innovative emergency response techniques, a milestone in her career, as one of the few black women who had risen to such prominence in a field dominated by white men. While the recognition was gratifying, the pressure was equally immense, the constant need to excel, to prove herself in a space that often reminded her she didn't quite belong. Sliding into the back seat of a taxi, Danielle sighed deeply as the driver stowed her luggage. The soft leather seat provided a small comfort as she settled in, allowing her muscles to relax for the first time in days. This moment, right here, she had earned it. "To SeaTac Airport, please," she said softly, her voice heavy with the week's weariness. As the car pulled away from the curb, the soft hum of the engine mixed with the faint jazz of the radio. Danielle looked out the window at the city, watching the skyscrapers blur as the taxi threaded through the traffic. The city bustled with life, but she felt strangely disconnected from it, her mind drifting with exhaustion. The past few days had been a success, but like every accomplishment in her career, it had come at a cost. A reminder that for black women in medicine, the path to success required twice as much effort. Her thoughts turned to the diversity panel she attended on the summit's final day. The room was filled with polite smiles, but there was an unspoken tension, a subtle acknowledgement of the relentless challenges facing professionals like her. "Dr. Carter, could you share some of the obstacles you've faced as a woman of color in medicine?" a moderator asked her, her voice laden with an almost too perfect sympathy. Danielle had given her usual answer, a careful balance between optimism and realism. But beneath it all, the reality was far more complicated. It wasn't just the blatant acts of racism that weighed on her. It was the subtler, more insidious moments, the way people's expressions changed when they realized she was the lead doctor, or how patients questioned her credentials in a way they didn't with her white colleagues. As the airport came into view, Danielle snapped out of her reverie. The taxi pulled up, and the driver handed her luggage to a bellhop. With a polite thank you, she paid the fare and entered through the sliding doors into the bustling terminal. The chaos of the airport swirled around her, families rushing to their gates, flight announcements blaring overhead, and the constant sound of suitcases rolling across the tile floor. Yet she moved through it all with practiced ease, already imagining the comfort of her first-class seat and the brief respite it promised. The check-in counter for first-class passengers. The airline was located in a quieter corner of the terminal. As she approached, a smiling airline attendant greeted her, glancing curiously at Danielle's conference badge. "Good evening, Dr. Carter. Heading home?" the young woman asked, her tone polite, if slightly rehearsed. "Yes, heading back to Atlanta," Danielle replied with a warm smile of her own. The attendant quickly scanned her ticket and passport, handing them back to her with a knowing nod. Long trip? Danielle nodded, feeling the tiredness in every fiber of her body. It's been a busy week. The attendant gave her a sympathetic smile. Well, I hope you enjoy your flight. First class should give you the rest you deserve. Thank you, Danielle said softly, taking her boarding pass and heading toward the security line reserved for first-class passengers. As she waited in line, she reflected on the strange atmosphere of airports, their ability to feel like a world apart from reality. A liminal space between destinations where people flowed, but never truly inhabited. It was one of the few places where Danielle could blend into the crowd, where she was neither a doctor nor a keynote speaker, just another traveler among many. The security process was efficient, and it wasn't long before Danielle was walking through the spacious departure lounge, her eyes lazily scanning the shops and restaurants that lined the terminal. She wasn't hungry, but the familiar act of walking through an airport gave her a sense of normalcy after the intense days of the conference. Passing a newspaper stand, Danielle caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass. She paused, studying her appearance. Her deep brown skin glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her short curly hair framed her face with confidence and grace. Her professional attire, pressed slacks and a smart blouse, reflected the career she had worked so hard to build. But her eyes betrayed a deep weariness that no amount of professional composure could completely conceal. As she continued walking, her thoughts returned to the journey that had brought her here, a path filled with obstacles, both personal and professional. Being a black woman in medicine was a constant challenge, but she had persisted. Even now, having made her mark in a field that often seemed reluctant to acknowledge her presence, there was always a part of her that remained on guard, ever aware of the subtle biases that lingered in the background. Arriving at her gate, Danielle scanned the area for a seat and made her way to an empty one by the window. Slumped in her chair, she pulled out her phone and flipped through the hospital emails. As expected, several urgent messages awaited her. Questions about upcoming shifts, patient updates, and requests for her opinion on cases. Danielle answered the most pressing ones, but her heart wasn't entirely in it. She needed a break, a moment to reset before plunging back into the chaos of the emergency room. The boarding announcement didn't take long to come, and Danielle stood up with the first group to board. The airline attendant greeted her with a smile, scanning her boarding pass, and Danielle made her way through the boarding bridge, leaving the noise and frenzy of the airport behind. The moment she stepped into the first-class cabin, a wave of relief washed over her. The wide, soft leather seats and dim lighting felt like an oasis compared to the bustle outside. A flight attendant approached her with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Carter. Let us know if you need anything during the flight." Danielle smiled back, though it barely disguised her exhaustion. "Thank you. I just need some peace of mind," she said, settling into her seat. As she adjusted the seat recline and placed the noise-canceling headphones around her neck, she allowed herself to relax, sinking into the soft cushion. The soft hum of the plane's engines and the faint murmur of a few passengers created a calm she had longed for. Just as she was about to close her eyes, a small commotion near the front of the cabin caught her attention. A boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, was struggling with his seatbelt, frustration etched on his face. His mother, a tall, thin, white-skinned woman, was busy arranging her bags in the overhead bin, her expression tense with impatience. Danielle's instincts kicked in before she even realized. Leaning over with a soft smile, she said to the boy, "Here, let me help you with that," as she leaned over to fasten his seatbelt. The boy looked up at her, his big eyes shining. She smiled gratefully. Her earlier frustration faded into an enthusiastic smile. "Thank you," she exclaimed, her voice filled with relief and appreciation. Danielle smiled back, her heart warmed by the child's innocence. But as she settled back into her seat, she caught the cold, lingering gaze of the child's mother. Her face was neutral, but the tension around her lips and the slight narrowing of her eyes spoke volumes. Danielle felt a familiar chill run down her spine, a look she'd seen too many times before. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Unspoken disapproval, silent contempt. Danielle let it pass, convincing herself that the woman was just stressed about traveling with a small child. Still, the moment lingered, casting a shadow over the peace she'd hoped to find on this flight. More passengers began to fill the first-class cabin, but Danielle barely noticed them. She was too busy trying to let go of the awkwardness that had settled in her. She leaned back against the soft headrest with a simple plan: to zone out, close her eyes, and let the gentle hum of the plane lull her into relaxation. But the look of the boy's mother, that sharp, quiet judgment, stayed with her, a silent thorn in her mind. Travel had always been a lonely escape for Danielle. It was her chance to disconnect from the world, from the weight of her responsibilities. Flying allowed her to shed the mantle of Dr. Danielle Carter, the ever-composed emergency medical professional. But tonight that mantle felt heavier than usual, and the first-class cabin, normally a sanctuary, felt unexpectedly stifling. She pulled out her phone again, scrolling through her emails. More reminders of the work that awaited her in Atlanta. Shifts to cover, patient updates, and cases that needed her input. But her heart wasn't in it. She sighed softly, closing the inbox and putting her phone away. The weight of the conference, the constant need to perform, and now this brief, unsettling moment of racial tension, it all swirled through her mind, making it impossible to find the calm she so desperately needed. As the flight attendants began their routine safety demonstration, Danielle leaned her head against the window and watched the runway lights blur as the plane slowly moved forward. She closed her eyes, hoping she could finally fall asleep, if only for a few minutes. But just as the silence began to settle in, a high-pitched, irritated voice behind her broke the calm. "I'm not sitting next to him." Danielle's eyes snapped open. For a moment, she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. The voice was low, but the steady, simmering frustration was unmistakable. She sat up straighter, straining to hear more. Glancing over her shoulder, she caught a glimpse of the woman's face, Cody's mother. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the flight attendant replied, her voice soft but confused. "Is there a problem?" "Yes, there is a problem," the woman whispered, her voice growing louder, her irritation barely concealed. "I don't want to sit next to you." Danielle felt a wave of cold wash over her, a tightness in her chest. It wasn't the words themselves that cut deep, but the venom with which they were spoken. She knew immediately that the woman wasn't talking about her personal space or her seating preferences. She was talking about her, about Danielle's very presence, about the color of her skin. A sickening sense of familiarity washed over her as she gripped the armrest and clenched her fingers. Heat of indignation flared in her chest, but she held back and forced herself to maintain composure. She'd faced this before too many times. Subtle and not so subtle instances of racism, both inside and outside the hospital. Patients refusing to treat her. Colleagues who underestimated her abilities. The constant questioning of her competence simply because she didn't fit their narrow expectations. But this was something else. It was pure, unfiltered disdain pouring from the woman's lips, as if she had every right to demand that Danielle be eliminated, erased, simply for existing. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly nervous. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but all the seats are assigned. We're full in first class. There's nowhere else to move her." "Then move her to another seat," the woman snapped, her voice rising, her anger barely contained. "I paid for first class, and I expect to be treated accordingly." Danielle's heart was pounding, blood rushing through her ears. She could feel the weight of the other passengers' gazes on her, though no one said a word. The silence felt oppressive, thick with indifference. Yeah. She wasn't surprised, but it still hurt. No one ever spoke up at times like this. The flight attendant looked at Danielle, her expression torn and pained, caught between the customer's demands and the injustice unfolding before her. Danielle knew what was coming before the woman opened her mouth. It wasn't the first time someone had asked her to make others more comfortable at their expense. "Dr. Carter, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience," the flight attendant began, her voice wavering. "Would it be possible for you to—" Danielle's stomach twisted. There it was. The familiar request. Could she be the one to move? Could she give up her seat, her peace, her dignity, so someone else could feel more comfortable with her intolerance? She'd been here before, in different forms and settings, and it always felt the same. For a moment, she wanted to refuse. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stand her ground, to demand the respect she deserved. After all, she had earned her spot in first class, not just by paying for the ticket, but by enduring years of hard work, becoming one of the most respected emergency physicians in her field. She deserved to sit there as much as anyone else. But the exhaustion, the fatigue left by the conference, and the life spent fighting those battles was weighing her down. She was tired, so tired of always being the one who had to rise above, take the high road, be the better person. It wasn't fair. It was never fair. But fairness had never been a part of the world Danielle lived in. She took a deep breath, slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, gathering her things with a deliberate calm that belied the storm brewing inside her. The woman, the one who had demanded to be removed, was watching her with satisfaction, her arms crossed over her chest as if she had won some twisted victory. Danielle didn't look at her. Instead, she turned to the flight attendant, who looked visibly relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you so much, Dr. Carter?" The flight attendant whispered, her tone genuinely apologetic. "I'll find you a seat in coach." Danielle nodded wordlessly. She could feel the stares of the other passengers as she made her way to the back of the plane, their silence like a knife in her stomach. Some of them had probably heard the entire exchange, but no one had said anything. No one had intervened. It was always easier to pretend it wasn't her problem. She reached the crowded economy section. She sat down in her new seat, a stark contrast to the luxury she had just left behind. The armrests dipped into the sides of her seat, and there was barely enough leg room. But that wasn't what bothered her. It was the humiliation, the way she'd been made to feel small, invisible, and unworthy of the comfort and space she'd paid for. As the plane took off into the night sky, Danielle stared out the window, watching the city lights fade into the distance. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, strong, composed, but undeniably hurt. She tried to focus on her breathing, to calm the rising wave of frustration and anger that threatened to overwhelm her. She hadn't asked for this. All she wanted was to get home in peace, to enjoy a few hours of quiet before returning to the chaos of the emergency room. But once again, she'd been reminded that no matter how far she'd come, no matter how successful she was, there were still people who viewed her as less than. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a notification from the hospital reminding her of her upcoming shift. She grimaced and turned it off without reading the message. Work never let her go, even when she was miles away from her responsibilities. But tonight, the weight of the hospital's demands was nothing compared to the weight of what had just happened. Danielle leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes as the plane flew at 30,000 feet. She tried to let the steady hum of the engine calm her, but the events of the last hour replayed in her mind. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the pain of those words, that cold, contemptuous look from Cody's mother, hurt her more than she expected. The silence in the cabin was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional murmur of voices and the clinking of glasses in first class. Danielle couldn't help but wonder how many of the other passengers had watched the scene unfold and done nothing. Their indifference was almost as painful as the woman's open hostility. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she was stronger than this. I had faced worse things, overcome greater obstacles, and built a life that most people could only dream of. But even as she repeated those words in her mind, the bitterness lingered. It always did. Danielle sat stiffly in the cramped seat of economy class, her shoulders uncomfortably brushing the edges of the chair. The shift from the spacious luxury of first class to the cramped confines of economy class was jarring, not just physically, but emotionally. She had been relegated to that space not because of a seating mistake, but because of someone's unspoken prejudice. The low murmur of conversations around her felt distant, like a muted soundtrack to her thoughts. She stared out the window, watching the dark night sky swallow the last glimmers of the city lights far below. The rhythmic hum of the plane's engines should have been reassuring, but instead it only amplified the tension building inside her chest. There was a time when she would have fought back, when she could have spoken up, demanded respect, and refused to be moved from her rightful seat. But that night, the weight of countless similar encounters over the years was too heavy to bear. The subtle and blatant slights she had faced throughout her career had piled up like stones, each adding to the burden until it became unbearable. Danielle closed her eyes, resting her head against the headrest. She was used to being underestimated. Even as a child growing up in Georgia, she had quickly learned that the world was not fair to people who looked like her. Teachers had doubted her abilities despite her natural aptitude for science and math. Later, in medical school, professors and classmates saw her as an outsider. But she had soldiered on, overcoming every challenge, every slight, and building a life most people could only dream of. Yet there she was again, forced to sacrifice her dignity for the comfort of someone else's ignorance. Danielle shifted in her seat, the tightness in her chest increasing. She thought about how she had handled the situation in first class, how she had swallowed her pride and moved without making a scene. She had felt it was the right thing to do to keep her composure, but part of her wished she had stood her ground. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter from across the aisle. Danielle glanced to the side to see a group of businessmen chatting loudly, their suits slightly askew as they settled into their seats. One of them, a middle-aged man in a silver tie, leaned toward his companion with a smirk. "Looks like someone couldn't handle first class," he muttered quietly, but not quietly enough to be unnoticeable. Danielle's jaw tightened as she turned her gaze back to the window. The familiar burn of anger rose in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had long since mastered the art of masking her emotions, keeping her face neutral and composed, even as every fiber of her being wanted to lash out. But tonight, it was harder than usual. The man's words echoed through her mind, reminding her of the countless times people had questioned her place in spaces she had rightfully earned. Whether it was in a hospital boardroom or a first-class cabin, there were always people who assumed she didn't belong there. She took a deep breath, trying to let the anger go, but it clung to her like a shadow, refusing to be ignored. She glanced at her phone, checking the time. The flight had barely begun, and the thought of enduring several more hours of tension made her stomach turn. Suddenly, the plane passed through a patch of turbulence, shaking her in her seat. The overhead bins vibrated and passengers murmured nervously as the plane shook. Danielle gripped the armrest, steadying herself as the turbulence passed, but her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the simmering frustration that had been building since she got on the plane. As the plane stabilized, Danielle's thoughts turned back to medical school, the beginning of her journey into a world that often felt hostile to her. She recalled the long nights of studying, the endless rounds of clinical rotations, and the constant pressure to prove herself. There had been moments of triumph, but also moments of deep doubt, moments when she wondered if the weight of her identity was too much to bear in a field that didn't always value her contributions. A memory surfaced, her third year of medical school, during her first clinical rotation in the emergency department. She had been eager, energized, and ready to go. But her enthusiasm had been met with skepticism by one of the attending physicians, Dr. Richardson, an older white man with a gruff demeanor. He hadn't bothered to hide his doubts about her abilities. One particularly busy night, Danielle had been the first to respond to a critically ill patient, an older woman who had gone into cardiac arrest. Danielle acted quickly, performing chest compressions and guiding the medical team with a confidence that belied her inexperience. The patient survived, and the rest of the team praised Danielle's quick reaction. But Dr. Richardson barely acknowledged his role in the patient's survival. Instead, he took her aside afterward, his tone cold and condescending. "You got lucky this time," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But don't get too comfortable. You have a lot to prove if you want to succeed in this field." The word stung, but Danielle forced herself to smile and nod, knowing that any sign of weakness would only fuel her doubts. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her abilities, and it wouldn't be the last. But she kept going, determined to overcome the judgments of people like Dr. Richardson. Now, sitting in the cramped seat of coach, those memories felt all too familiar. The faces had changed, but the underlying prejudice remained the same. Danielle was still struggling to make her way in a world that often refused to make room for her. Danielle sighed, closed her eyes, and tried to shake off the heaviness of the past. She was stronger now, more resilient. She had carved out a career as a respected emergency physician, and no one could take it away from her. But still, the scars from those early years still lingered, surfacing at times like this, when she remembered that no matter how far she had come, the world still saw her in ways she couldn't control. The plane leveled out and the turbulence faded into a soft hum. Danielle forced herself to relax, breathing slowly and deeply as she focused on the steady beat of the engines. She needed to clear her mind, to let go of the tension that had settled in her chest. After all, there was nothing she could do now. She had chosen economy class to avoid a confrontation, and now all she could do was endure the long flight ahead. Just as she began to drift into a light sleep, a sharp sound cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. A child's cry, high-pitched and panicked. Danielle's eyes snapped open and her heart immediately raced. She recognized that cry. It was Cody. Danielle's instincts kicked in and all traces of exhaustion and frustration disappeared as she snapped to attention. Her eyes darted to the front of the cabin where she saw Cody, the child she had helped into his seatbelt, struggling in his seat, his small hands clutching his throat. His face was red, twisted with fear as he gasped for air. A familiar feeling of terror washed over Danielle as she realized what was happening. Cody was drowning. Without thinking, Danielle unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, moving quickly down the aisle. Danielle moved quickly down the aisle toward Cody's seat in first class. Flight attendants were already hovering nearby, their faces pale with concern, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Cody's mother, Melissa, the same woman who had demanded that Danielle be moved, was frantic, waving her hands. Danielle desperately paced around her son, her voice high-pitched and panicked as she begged him to breathe. But it was clear that Cody couldn't. His breaths were shallow and labored, each one a desperate gasp for air that wasn't reaching his lungs. Danielle didn't wait for permission. She knelt down beside Cody's seat and placed a gentle but firm hand on his back. "I'm a doctor," she said, her voice firm as she addressed the flight attendants and Melissa. "He's having an asthma attack. Do you have an inhaler?" Melissa, eyes wide with terror, seemed frozen for a moment, unable to process what Danielle had said. Then, as if coming out of a trance, she shook her head frantically. No, he left it in the car." Her voice shook, her hands trembling as she gripped Cody's arm. I didn't think he'd need it." Danielle's heart sank. An asthma attack at 30,000 feet without an inhaler was dangerous. They needed to get Cody's breathing under control. And fast. "Listen to me," Danielle said, her voice calm but authoritative. "I need you to help me keep him calm. The more he panics, the harder it will be for him to breathe. Why don't you help him?" "Can you do that?" Melissa, her eyes filling with tears, nodded as she took Cody's hand, her attempts to calm him clouded by her own panic. Danielle turned to the nearest flight attendant who was anxiously standing by Cody's seat. "I need oxygen now," she ordered, leaving no room for doubt. "Get me an oxygen mask, a tank, and any other medical supplies you have." The flight attendant hurried away and Danielle returned her attention to Cody, whose gasps were becoming more erratic. His small chest rose and fell in frantic, uneven movements. Danielle placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Hey, Cody," she said softly. "I'm going to help you, okay? But I need you to try to breathe slowly with me. Can you do that?" Breathe deeply. Like this. She demonstrated, inhaling slowly and exhaling in a steady stream. Cody tried to imitate her, but his breathing was shallow and labored. His wide, frightened eyes locked with hers, and in that moment, Danielle saw the trust he placed in her. Despite his panic, despite his fear, he believed she could help him. The flight attendant returned with the oxygen tank, and Danielle wasted no time in securing the mask over Cody's face. She adjusted the flow, watching closely as his breathing began to slow, though it was still labored. Beside him, Melissa whispered through choked sobs, "You're going to be okay, sweetheart. Keep breathing. Dr. Carter is helping you." Danielle glanced briefly at Melissa, noting the change in her tone, the soft gratitude that hadn't been there before. The same woman who had looked down on her was now depending on her to save her son's life. But there was no time to dwell on that. Cody's breathing, though improved, was still shaky, and without his inhaler, they were completely dependent on oxygen. Danielle focused all her attention on Cody, her hands firm on his shoulder, and her voice calm as she guided him through each breath. Her mind raced through possible scenarios. If his condition worsened, they would have to make an emergency landing. As she worked, she could feel the gazes of the other passengers on her. Those who had been indifferent or dismissive now watched with something closer to respect. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was keeping Cody safe. After what seemed like an eternity, Cody's breathing began to steady. His chest rose and fell at a more even pace, thanks to the steady flow of oxygen. Danielle remained kneeling beside him, monitoring his pulse, her focus unwavering. Melissa sat next to her son, her gaze never leaving his face. But there was something different in her gaze now, something deeper, more vulnerable. Danielle could feel the shift between them. Melissa had gone from treating her like a stranger to trusting her completely. It wasn't just desperation, it was a realization, an acknowledgement that she had been wrong to judge Danielle so quickly, to make assumptions based solely on skin color. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Melissa whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. "I'm so sorry. For everything." Danielle didn't respond immediately. Her attention remained on Cody, adjusting the oxygen mask as her breathing grew deeper and steadier. But she felt the weight of Melissa's words, the unspoken apology hanging in the air between them. Melissa's voice cracked as she continued, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "I judged you. I treated you terribly. I can't believe I did that." Danielle finally met her eyes, her expression calm but unreadable. "Let's focus on Cody right now," she said quietly. "We can deal with the rest later." Melissa swallowed hard and nodded as she wiped a tear from her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Danielle nodded and turned her attention back to Cody, who was now resting peacefully, breathing slowly and steadily beneath the mask. The crisis had passed, but there was nothing to be done. But the weight of the moment remained, not just in the silence of the cabin, but in the unspoken understanding between two mothers, one saving the life of the other's child, both forever changed by the experience. Danielle turned her attention back to Cody, a swirl of emotions brewing inside her. She wasn't looking for gratitude or an apology, but the change in Melissa's tone and demeanor was undeniable. It was a stark reminder of how quickly perceptions can change, how easy it is for someone to go from seeing you as less than to realizing that their life, or the life of a loved one, is in your hands. The cabin had fallen silent. Tension thick in the air as the other passengers watched the scene unfold. Danielle could feel their collective unease, their discomfort at what had happened earlier, now eclipsed by concern for Cody. For once, she wasn't the center of attention because of the color of her skin, but because she was the person saving a child's life. For a moment, Danielle allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. The exhaustion, the frustration, the injustice of having to prove herself over and over again. But she didn't let it consume her. Reflection could come later. Right now, her attention was focused on keeping Cody stable. As the minutes ticked by, it felt like hours. Slowly, The tension in the cabin began to ease. Cody's breathing had stabilized, and though his face remained pale, the panic had left his eyes. He held tightly to his mother's hand, but the terror that had gripped him was easing. Danielle stood up, her knees stiff from kneeling for so long, and looked at the flight attendant who was watching her in silent amazement. "We'll have to keep him on oxygen until we land," Danielle said, her voice calm but firm. "If anything changes, we'll have to make an emergency landing." The flight attendant nodded quickly and hurried off to inform the captain. Melissa remained by her son's side, still holding his hand, but her eyes were fixed on Danielle, filled with guilt and gratitude. As Danielle walked back to her seat, she could feel the passengers' gazes on her again, but this time, their gazes were different. There was no judgment or disdain. Instead, their gazes reflected something akin to respect. Danielle didn't need their validation, but it felt good to be seen as she truly was. A doctor, a professional, someone who had earned her place in the world, regardless of what anyone else thought. Despite the relief she felt at steadying Cody's breathing, Danielle knew she shouldn't let her guard down. Asthma attacks were unpredictable, especially at high altitudes. Without their inhaler, they were just buying time. Oxygen was helping, but it wasn't a cure. Danielle looked at Cody. His chest rose and fell rhythmically, but his skin was still pale, and the slight wheezing in his breathing worried her. Melissa, her earlier panic tempered to brittle concern, watched Danielle closely, as if seeking reassurance. "He's stable for now," Danielle explained, keeping her voice steady. "But without his inhaler, we need to be prepared for changes. We need to stay calm and keep him breathing slowly." Melissa nodded, her face pale and drawn, fear clear in her eyes. "You're not saying this is over, are you?" she whispered. Danielle shook her head slightly, her expression serious. "No. Asthma attacks can flare up without warning, especially up here. I'll stay with him and monitor his breathing, but if things get worse, we'll have to make an emergency landing." Melissa's face paled even further as her mouth dropped open in shock. She looked at Cody, her fingers tightening on his hand. "Oh God. I can't believe this is happening. How could I forget his inhaler?" Danielle heard the guilt creeping into Melissa's voice, but she didn't address it. There was no time for that now. Cody's breathing was getting more labored, his small chest rising and falling unevenly again. The cabin had grown even quieter, the passengers now watching with tense, anxious expressions. It was as if the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting. Suddenly, Cody's breathing hitched. His small body stiffened, and his hand instinctively went to his throat, his fingers grasping for air in a desperate attempt to breathe. Danielle's heart skipped a beat. She knelt beside him again, her mind racing through options. His oxygen levels were dropping, and the mask was no longer sufficient. "We need to give him more oxygen," Danielle said sharply, turning to the nearby flight attendant. "We need to prepare for a descent. We can't wait much longer." The flight attendant nodded and ran into the cockpit, her face pale as she spoke into her radio. Danielle turned to Cody, keeping her voice low and calm. "Cody, I need you to breathe slowly, okay? Same as before. Stay with me. We're going to get you more help, but I need you to stay calm." But Cody's breathing was becoming more and more erratic. His wide, frightened eyes moved from Danielle to his father. She, who was sitting next to him, was crying softly as she clutched his hand, willing him to breathe. Time was running out. They were still at cruising altitude, too high for Cody's lungs to handle without the help of a nurse. Proper restraint. Danielle felt a surge of urgency. She turned to Melissa, who was nearly paralyzed with fear. "Listen, Melissa," she said firmly, getting her attention. "I need you to help me keep him calm. I know it's hard, but the more stressed he is, the harder it will be for him to breathe." Melissa nodded through her tears, trying to compose herself enough to do as Danielle asked. She leaned closer to Cody, her voice shaky but filled with a mother's desperate love. "It's okay, baby. We're going to help you through this. Keep breathing, okay?" Danielle watched as Melissa struggled to remain calm, her previous prejudice and anger now forgotten in the face of her son's danger. There was no room for anything else, no judgment, no resentment, just the overwhelming fear of a mother who didn't know if her son would survive the next hour. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, drawing Danielle's attention away from Cody. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been notified of a medical emergency on board. We will be making an emergency descent to Denver International Airport. Flight attendants, prepare for descent." A wave of murmurs spread through the cabin, but Danielle felt a surge of relief. Finally, action was being taken. The plane began its rapid descent almost immediately, the sudden drop in altitude causing a brief change in pressure in the cabin. The passengers shifted restlessly in their seats, but the urgency of the situation kept them silent. Danielle remained at Cody's side, her hands firm on his shoulder as she monitored his breathing. The oxygen mask was still in place, but his small face remained tense. The tightness around his eyes and the pale tone of his skin still a worrying sign. She leaned closer, her voice soft but firm. "You're doing great, Cody. Keep breathing deeply. We're almost there." Melissa, still holding Cody's hand, looked at Danielle, her face streaked with tears. "What if we don't make it in time?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Danielle looked into her eyes, calm but serious. "We will. We're doing everything we can right now, and so are you. Just stay focused on him." Melissa nodded, her lips pressed together as she tried to hold back a sob. The vulnerability on her face was plain to see. Gone was the outraged woman who had demanded Danielle be moved. In her place was a mother consumed by fear and guilt, her whole world now focused on the child struggling to breathe beside her. The plane lurched as it passed through another patch of turbulence, sending a shudder through the cabin. Danielle braced herself, her fingers tightening around the armrest next to Cody's seat. The descent was sharp, fast, and bumpy, but they had no choice. They had to land as soon as possible. Emma, the flight attendant, returned from the cockpit, her face tense with worry as she knelt beside Danielle. "We're about 15 minutes from landing," she said quietly. "Paramedics will be waiting on the tarmac as soon as we land." Danielle nodded, keeping her attention on Cody. "Good. Tell them you're having a severe asthma attack. We've been using oxygen, but without your inhaler, your airway is still constricted." Emma relayed the information over her radio, her tone tense but professional. Danielle appreciated her efficiency. There was no room for doubt now. As the plane continued its descent, Danielle looked around the cabin. The other passengers watched her, their faces reflecting a variety of emotions: fear, worry, and something that resembled amazement. The businessman from earlier, who had made a sarcastic comment when she upgraded to economy class, now stared at her with wide eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. But Danielle didn't care about their opinions. All that mattered was that Cody survived the next few minutes. The tension in the cabin was palpable, as if the entire plane was holding its collective breath, waiting for the descent to end. Cody's breathing was still shallow, but his eyes had closed, his small body finally relaxing a little under the steady flow of oxygen. Danielle kept her hand on his shoulder, her heart racing as she silently counted down the minutes until they landed. For Melissa, each second seemed to stretch into eternity. She couldn't take her eyes off her son, her face etched with the kind of fear only a parent can understand. "He should have brought his inhaler," she whispered, her voice choked with guilt. "How could I have been so careless?" Danielle's voice was soft but firm. "It's not your fault, Melissa. You're here now, and that's what matters. Orta, you're doing everything you can." Melissa nodded, but the guilt remained in her eyes. She looked back at Danielle, her expression torn with emotion. "I treated you so badly, horribly before. I didn't even give you a chance. And now you're the one saving my son's life." Danielle held her gaze for a moment, her face unreadable. "We'll talk about that later," she said quietly. "Right now we need to focus on Cody." Melissa's tears were falling freely now, but she nodded, her hands still wrapped around Cody's. Danielle could feel the weight of the unspoken apology between them, but she didn't dwell on it. There would be time to process all of that later. The minutes ticked by, each one agonizingly slow. The plane continued its rapid descent, and Danielle could feel the pressure in the cabin change as they dropped in altitude. Cody's breathing was still labored, but he was holding on. Danielle stayed by his side, guiding him through each breath, her own anxiety carefully hidden behind a mask of calm. Finally, the plane's wheels touched down with a jarring thud, the screeching sound of brakes filling the cabin as the plane slowed. Danielle let out a long sigh, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease a little. They had made it. The flight attendants moved quickly, opening the door to allow the paramedics on board. Within moments, they were at Cody's side, assessing his condition and preparing to transfer him to the waiting ambulance. Danielle stepped back, allowing them to take control as she gave them a brief rundown of what had happened. "He's stable for now but needs immediate treatment," Danielle said, her voice calm but urgent. "He didn't have his inhaler, and we've been using oxygen to keep him breathing." The paramedics nodded, working quickly as they placed Cody on a stretcher. Melissa followed close behind, never taking her eyes off her son as the paramedics began to wheel him toward the exit. Just before they reached the door, Melissa turned to Danielle, her face a mix of gratitude and remorse. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know how to thank you." "Thank you." Danielle nodded slightly, her expression calm but tired. "Take care of him," she said quietly. "That's all that matters now." Melissa nodded, her lips trembling as she followed the paramedics out of the plane. The cabin remained silent as the door closed behind them, the tension finally breaking as the other passengers began to stir. Danielle stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the past few hours settle on her. She had done what she always did, saved a life. But the emotional toll of the night weighed heavily on her. Unspoken conflicts and silent victories intertwined in a way that left her feeling triumphant and exhausted at the same time. As the paramedics left, the hum of conversations in the cabin began to pick up again. The other passengers were slowly emerging from their shocked silence, their voices low and hesitant, as if they were unsure of how to process what had just happened. Danielle could feel their gazes on her, but this time the weight of their stares didn't feel like judgment, but respect. She returned to her seat, feeling weariness settling into her bones as she sank into the chair. Her muscles ached from the strain of the past few hours, and her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was relieved that Cody was safe, but the emotional fallout from the confrontation with Melissa still loomed over her like a storm cloud. Emma, the flight attendant, approached her quietly, her face filled with sympathy. "Dr. Carter," she began, her voice soft. "Thank you so much for everything you did. I don't know how we would have handled it without you." Danielle nodded, offering a tired smile. "I'm just glad you're okay." Emma hesitated for a moment, then looked around the cabin before speaking again. "You've done it all so gracefully, even after what happened earlier with that woman. I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Danielle's smile faded a little, her eyes growing distant as she recalled the scene from earlier, the way Melissa had demanded she be moved, the cold look in her eyes, the utter lack of respect. It all felt so distant now, overshadowed by the crisis that had erupted afterwards, but the pain was still there, lingering beneath the surface. "It happens more often than you think," Danielle said quietly, her voice tinged with a hint of sadness. "But that doesn't make it any easier." Emma nodded, her expression filled with quiet understanding. "If there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let me know." Danielle nodded in thanks, but all she wanted now was peace. As Emma left, Danielle leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The other passengers were still whispering, their voices a low hum that spread through the cabin. But Danielle wasn't listening. She was too tired to care what they thought, too tired to wonder if the respect they were now showing her was genuine or simply born of the fact that she had saved a life. The businessmen from before, the ones who had scoffed at her move to economy class, were now quiet. Danielle glanced at them briefly, catching the nervous flicker of their eyes as they avoided her gaze. Danielle could see the discomfort on their faces, the subtle shift in their posture. They had seen her differently before, dismissed her, judged her, but now their opinions had changed and it was clear they were uncomfortable with that realization. She sighed, her mind drifting back to Melissa. The woman's tearful apology echoed in her thoughts, a harsh reminder of how easy it was for people to change their tune when they realized they were wrong. But the apology didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo the fact that Melissa had judged her without knowing anything about her. And yet, in the end, Danielle had chosen to move past it. She had done her job, saved Cody's life, and put her own feelings aside in the process. It was what she had always done. But tonight, the weight of it all felt heavier than usual. As the plane began final preparations for takeoff to Atlanta, Danielle allowed herself to close her eyes and let the hum of the engines wash over her. She would process it all later. Melissa's apology, the newfound respect from the other passengers, the bitterness that still lingered in her chest. For now, all she wanted was a moment of quiet, a moment to breathe. The plane had landed at Denver International Airport, and Cody had been rushed to an ambulance waiting on the tarmac. Danielle watched from the door of the plane as the paramedics worked quickly, Melissa hovering near her son, still pale with fear. The flight crew was busy coordinating with the ground staff, making sure the rest of the passengers remained seated while the medical team did their work. Danielle stood on the jetway, slightly apart from the rest of the cabin, feeling the cool night air coming in from outside. Her pulse was still elevated, her mind replaying the last few hours in sharp, vivid detail. The adrenaline that had gotten her through Cody's emergency had begun to wear off, leaving a heavy weight in its place, a mix of exhaustion and emotional fatigue. She'd done her job, she'd saved Cody, but the events of the night, the confrontation with Melissa, the judgment she'd faced from the other passengers, still gnawed at her. The silence in the first-class cabin had been the hardest to bear. No one had spoken up for her, and even now, as they sat safely on the floor, she knew most of them would rather forget what had happened. The paramedics lifted Cody to the back of the ambulance, and Melissa turned to look back at the plane, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Danielle. Their gazes met for a moment, and Danielle could see the storm of emotions on Melissa's face: relief, guilt, gratitude, and something else. Something unspoken. Danielle nodded, offering her a small, reassuring smile before turning back toward the cabin. She didn't need to hear the words Melissa might have wanted to say. It was enough for her to know that Cody was in good hands and that Melissa had seen what she hadn't seen before. But the heaviness in her chest lingered. There was no satisfaction in being right when it came at the cost of such a trying emotional experience. The flight attendants had begun preparing the cabin for takeoff once again, and Danielle returned to her seat. As she walked down the aisle, she felt the passengers' eyes following her, their expressions a mix of awkward sympathy and silent admiration. The businessmen who had made the snide comments earlier now sat in rigid silence, their eyes downcast. It was clear they had reevaluated their initial judgments, but their silence still felt hollow. Too little. Too late. Danielle slid into her seat, leaned back and closed her eyes as the sounds of the plane began to fade into the background. She had hoped to rest during this flight, but now the thought of closing her eyes and falling asleep felt impossible. The weight of the night's events loomed over her like a shadow, refusing to let her go. The flight attendant, Emma, came back to check on her. "Dr. Carter," she said softly, crouching down next to Danielle's seat. "I just wanted to thank you again. I don't know what we would have done without you." Danielle opened her eyes and offered a tired but grateful smile. "You're welcome, Emma. I'm just glad Cody's okay." Emma hesitated and looked around the cabin before speaking again. "It wasn't just that. I'm sorry about what happened earlier with that woman. She shouldn't have been treated that way." Danielle's expression remained neutral, though she appreciated Emma's sincerity. "It happens," she said quietly. "More often than I should." Emma's face tightened with discomfort. "Well, for what it's worth, You handled everything very gracefully. I'll write up a report for the airline and make sure they know exactly what happened tonight." Danielle nodded, though she knew that no report would really change the underlying issues that had led to the situation in the first place. She had faced prejudice all her life and knew that it wasn't something a single incident could fix. But Emma's gesture was kind and Danielle appreciated it. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate it." Emma smiled briefly before standing up and moving past the other passengers, leaving Danielle alone with her thoughts once again. After about an hour on the tarmac, the flight was cleared for takeoff again. The passengers had grown restless, but no one complained, perhaps out of respect for what had happened, or perhaps because they were simply too shaken to care. As the plane climbed into the sky, Danielle leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights of Denver fade into the distance. The cabin was quiet now, the passengers subdued, but the silence didn't bring Danielle the peace she'd hoped for. The events of the night kept replaying in her mind. The tense moments, Melissa's hostility, and the fear that had gripped everyone during Cody's attack. Danielle had thought she could get over it, but anger still simmered beneath the surface, a low, persistent burn that refused to go away. Danielle had gotten over it. Yes, she'd done the right thing even in the face of blatant disrespect. But why did she always have to be the bigger person? As the plane reached cruising altitude, the flight attendant returned to the cockpit and offered refreshments. Danielle declined, her stomach too knotted with frustration to even think about eating. She needed to focus, to process what had happened and to figure out how to move forward. Just as she was about to settle into her seat, she heard a voice. "Dr. Carter?" Danielle looked up and saw Melissa standing in the aisle, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands clenched nervously. Her expression was filled with remorse. Can I sit with you for a moment?" Melissa asked, her voice shaking. Danielle hesitated. Her emotions were still too raw to engage in meaningful conversation, but she could see the desperation on Melissa's face, the genuine regret. She knew the woman was struggling with more than just guilt over forgetting her son's inhaler. With a small sigh, Danielle nodded. "Of course." Melissa slid into the seat across from her, her movements hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she deserved to be there. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, her eyes filling with tears once again. I don't even know where to begin," Melissa said, her voice thick with emotion. "I treated you so horribly before, and now after everything you did for Cody, I just don't know how to fix it." Danielle looked at her with an unreadable expression. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Why did you assume I didn't belong in the first class?" Melissa's face scrunched up and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know. I mean, I know, but I didn't think. She shook her head, struggling to find the words. "I grew up in a place where people like me, we weren't exposed to people like you. I was raised to think certain things and I didn't question it." Danielle's stomach twisted. She'd heard this story before, countless times. The excuses, the explanations. People were not born with hate in their hearts, but they were taught to see others as different, as inferior. And sometimes that teaching. The teaching was so deep that people didn't even realize they were carrying it with them. "I thought you were going to judge me," Melissa admitted, her voice cracking. "I saw you sitting there and assumed you didn't belong here, that you were going to look down on me. I don't even know why I thought that. But then you helped Cody and saved him, and I don't know how to fix what I did." Danielle's chest tightened with a mix of sadness and anger. She'd faced this kind of prejudice her entire life. People made assumptions about her, doubted her abilities, treated her like she didn't belong here. And yet here Melissa was, finally realizing the weight of her own prejudices, begging for forgiveness, as if it would erase what had happened. "You can't fix it," Danielle said softly. "You can't undo what you did. But you can start by examining why you felt that way in the first place." Melissa's tears flowed freely now, and she nodded, her voice barely audible as she whispered, I will. I swear I will. There was a long silence between them, the only sound the hum of the plane's engine as they flew through the night sky. Danielle watched Melissa intently, sensing the woman's genuine remorse, but knowing that this moment of clarity didn't mean everything would change overnight. I don't need your apologies, Melissa, Danielle said finally, her voice firm but steady. What I need is for you to take what happened tonight and learn from it. Teach your son differently. Make sure he grows up seeing people as they are, not as they look. Melissa nodded quickly, her lips trembling as she wiped her eyes. I will, she whispered again, her voice filled with resolve. Danielle studied her for a moment longer, then sighed, leaning back in her seat. That's all I ask. Melissa sat there for a few more moments, her face marked with guilt and determination. Finally, she stood up, her hands still shaking slightly as she whispered one last, "Thank you," before returning to her seat. Danielle watched her go, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in her chest. She'd heard these kinds of apologies before, seen people realize their mistakes and vow to do better. But change was hard, and it wasn't something that happened in a single conversation. It took time and effort. But as she watched Melissa return to her seat, her shoulders slumped under the weight of what she had learned tonight. Danielle allowed herself a small shred of hope. Maybe this time it would be different. As the flight continued its journey toward Atlanta, Danielle remained in her seat, staring out the window at the dark sky. The conversation with Melissa had left her exhausted, but there was also a sense of resolve, a quiet realization that while the world wasn't perfect, there was always room for growth. Danielle's mind drifted back to her childhood, to the lessons her parents had taught her about resilience and strength. Growing up as a black girl in the South, she had learned early on that the world wouldn't always be kind, that people would judge her before they knew her. But her parents had also taught her to stand strong in the face of adversity, to let her actions speak louder than words. And that night, that was exactly what she had done. Danielle hadn't needed to prove herself to Melissa or anyone else on that plane. Her actions had spoken for her skills, her knowledge, her compassion. In the end, that was what made the difference. As the plane began its descent toward Atlanta, she allowed herself to exhale. The long journey was almost over, and soon she would be back in the comfort of her home, away from the scrutiny of others and the weight of the night's events. The lessons of that night would stay with her, as they always had. Every experience, every confrontation with prejudice, added to the layers of strength she had built over the years. It wasn't fair or easy, but it had made her the person she was today, a person who saved lives, who rose above hate and ignorance, and who stood firm in her identity. The plane landed smoothly, and as passengers began to gather their belongings, Danielle sat for a moment, letting the weight of the night lift from her shoulders. She had done her job. She had done what she always did, and she would continue to do it, because that was who she was. As the passengers disembarked from the plane, several of them nodded, offering her small gestures of respect and gratitude. Danielle nodded, but her mind was already on the future, on the next flight, the next emergency, the next moment when she would be called to duty, rise above it all once again. And she would, because no matter what the world threw at her, Danielle knew she was strong enough to handle it. As the plane made its way to the gate at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Danielle felt a deep sense of relief wash over her. It had been a long and emotionally draining journey, one that had tested her patience, resilience, and strength in ways she hadn't expected. But she had made it through, and she was now home. The familiar lights of the airport flickered outside the window, and the quiet hum of the engines seemed like a lullaby compared to the chaos of the past few hours. Danielle leaned back in her seat, letting the tension in her shoulders ease as she watched the passengers around her slowly begin to gather their things. Despite the exhaustion weighing down on her, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had done what she came to do, not just as a doctor, but as a person. She had saved Cody's life, overcome the prejudices he faced, and handled the night's challenges with the grace and professionalism that had defined her career. Most importantly, she had maintained her integrity, even in the face of blatant disrespect. As passengers began to file off the plane, some of them gave her small nods or quietly murmured thanks. It wasn't the recognition she sought, she'd never needed it, but it was a reminder that her actions hadn't gone unnoticed. Even in the face of adversity, she had proven who she was. Danielle waited until the cabin cleared before standing and gathering her belongings. Her muscles ached from the long hours she'd spent sitting, and her mind still buzzed with the remnants of the night's events. But there was a certain Danielle moved lightly as she walked down the aisle toward the exit. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the familiar bustle of the airport greeted her. People rushed by, luggage rolling behind them, conversations blending into a dull hum. For a moment, Danielle simply stood there absorbing the energy of the place. It was the same as always, busy, chaotic, full of people heading to their next destination. But for her, this arrival felt different. It felt like a moment of closure. With a deep breath, Danielle began walking toward the baggage claim area, her suitcase rolling silently behind her. She was ready to leave the night behind, to leave the tension and emotions on the tarmac and return to the life she had built. A life defined by purpose and dedication, not the opinions of others. As she made her way through the terminal, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen to see a message from her friend and colleague, Dr. Angela Moore. "I just finished my shift. How was the flight?" Danielle smiled softly as she read the message, already imagining how she would tell Angela about the events of the night. She and Angela had known each other since their days as residents, and there was no one else who understood the unique challenges Danielle faced like she did. It would be nice to talk to someone who got it, someone who could relate. "Long story," Danielle wrote in response. "I'll tell you about it tomorrow." As she hit send, another message appeared, this time from an unknown number. "Dr. Carter, this is Melissa Jenkins. I just wanted to thank you again for everything you did for Cody. He's stable now, and the doctors say he'll be okay. I owe you more than I can say. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm working on being better, for Cody's sake and mine. I hope that one day I can show you that I've changed. Thanks again." Danielle stared at the text for a long moment, her mind racing through the conversation she'd had with Melissa on the plane, the apology, the tears, the genuine remorse in Melissa's voice. It had all been real, but Danielle knew that true change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and reflection. Still, the text felt like a small step in the right direction. With a sigh, Danielle pocketed her phone, gathered her things, and headed toward the exit, ready to move on to whatever came next. Danielle pocketed her phone and continued toward the baggage claim area. She didn't respond to Melissa's text, not yet. It wasn't a question of whether she forgave Melissa. It was a question of whether Melissa could truly grow from what had happened. That would take more than a text, but it was a start. On the baggage carousel, Danielle spotted her suitcase almost immediately. She grabbed it and headed for the exit. The cool Atlanta air greeted her as she stepped outside, and for the first time in hours, she felt like she could actually breathe. The cab ride home was quiet, giving her plenty of time to reflect on the events of the night. As the city lights faded, she thought about the emotional highs and lows, the scary moments and the quiet triumphs. In the emergency room, Danielle was used to life-or-death situations, to facing crises that tested her skills and her ability to remain calm. But tonight had been different. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about facing the prejudice that had been directed at her, facing the emotional toll of being judged by something as arbitrary as the color of her skin. Melissa's apology had been sincere, but Danielle knew this wasn't an isolated incident. The world was full of people like Melissa, people who carried prejudice without realizing it. And for people like Danielle, that prejudice was a constant presence, something she had to face time and time again. But that night, she had risen above it, using her skills, compassion, and resilience to help those in need. no matter how she had been treated. It wasn't about proving her worth, it was about staying true to who she was. As the cab pulled up in front of her house, Danielle paid the driver and stepped out onto the quiet street. The sight of her home brought her a comfort she hadn't realized she longed for. It was a modest but welcoming place, her sanctuary away from the chaos of the emergency room. She opened the door, stepped inside, and felt enveloped by the warmth of home. For the first time all night, she felt the full weight of her exhaustion. She set her bags on the floor, kicked off her shoes, and headed to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. As she drank, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The night had been challenging, but it had also reminded her of why she did what she did. Being an emergency physician wasn't just about saving lives, it was about being a source of strength in the face of fear, a beacon of hope when things seemed hopeless. And while the prejudice she'd faced was painful, it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had reminded her of her resilience, of the quiet power she carried within. The next morning, Danielle woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the window. Her body ached from the night before, but there was a sense of peace that accompanied her fatigue. She'd overcome another challenge, and today, she would return to the hospital ready to face whatever came next. As she dressed, her mind drifted to the moments on the plane. Cody's labored breathing, Melissa's tearful apology, the silent stares of the other passengers. It was still very fresh, but it already felt like it happened a lifetime ago. Before going to work, Danielle sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, checking her emails. There were updates from colleagues, reports from patients, and reminders about upcoming meetings. The usual work that calmed her after the emotional intensity of the flight. As she finished her coffee, a new message appeared in her inbox. It was from Melissa. Dr. Carter, I just wanted to let you know that Cody is doing much better this morning. The doctors say he will make a full recovery. I can't thank you enough for what you did, and I'm still thinking about everything we talked about. I know it's a long road ahead, but I'm committed to making changes, for Cody and for myself. Danielle read the message twice and let the words sink in. Part of her wanted to respond, to offer encouragement, but she knew that real change had to come from within. Melissa's journey was her own. Danielle had awakened something in her, but it was up to Melissa to continue down that path. Danielle put down her phone and finished getting ready. As she stepped out into the cool morning air, she felt a sense of renewal. The events of the previous night would stay with her, but they wouldn't define her. She had more important things to focus on: patients to treat, lives to save, and a future to build. As she drove to the hospital, with the city waking up around her, Danielle allowed herself a small smile. The world wasn't perfect, and there would always be challenges ahead, but she had faced them before, and she would face them again, with strength, resilience, and grace. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments below. What would you do in a similar situation? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family as a show of support. Your support keeps us going and helps us bring you more exciting stories. Don't miss the next exciting story coming, and click on the links that appear on your screen now for an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you in the next video. A hug.